Welcome to my video series covering the stories of classic Doctor Who. In this video, we will cover the introduction to the most well-known Doctor Who villain in a story aptly known as the Daleks. Having arrived at a petrified jungle, the Doctor, Ian, Susan and Barbara exit the TARDIS, being unaware that the outside has high radiation levels. Exploring the jungle, they discover a dead metal creature, confirming they are not on Earth, with the Doctor deducing that the planet is dead without a single living creature. The Doctor is at odds with Ian and Barbara after they reach the end of the jungle and notice a futuristic city that the Doctor wants to explore. Meanwhile, Susan is on her own when she is touched by a humanoid hand. Screaming, she returns to the others who don't believe her, and they all return to the TARDIS. A knocking from outside the TARDIS provokes Ian and Barbara to protest that they should leave this place. The Doctor, letting his curiosity of the futuristic city get the better of him, dismantles a piece of the TARDIS, exclaiming they need to venture into the city to find Mercury for the TARDIS's fluid link. A morning later, and the four emerge from the TARDIS, ready to travel into the city. In front of the TARDIS is a small box with vials of liquid. Susan moves this box into the TARDIS. Arriving at the city, the four discover that it is entirely comprised of metal, with round arched doorways that seem to expand into the distance. As the four travellers decide to separate, Barbara ventures the corridors on her own. She becomes trapped when the doors around her seal shut. An unknown creature approaches her, causing her to scream in horror. Wanting to find Barbara, the Doctor, Ian and Susan find a room full of machines, finally discovering the high levels of radiation they've been exposed to. The Doctor admits he deliberately tampered with the TARDIS to make them explore the city. Realising the seriousness of his mistake, he is willing to abandon Barbara to reach the TARDIS to save himself. During this, Ian takes the fluid link from the Doctor. They get ready to leave, but as they do, they are suddenly surrounded by the same thing that Barbara saw earlier, the Daleks. Ian tries to make an escape attempt, with the Daleks giving him temporary leg paralysis in return. Imprisoned, the three are reunited with Barbara. The Doctor is summoned by the Daleks for interrogation. During this, they state that they are survivors of a neutronic war with another species known as the Fouls, with the war having seemingly caused mutations within both races. Stuck in their travel machines, the Daleks are unable to leave the perimeter of their metallic city due to the static electricity powering them. The Doctor is able to convince the Daleks that the four of them are dying of radiation sickness, so the Daleks request that one of the travellers is sent away to find the cure. Susan is tasked with this when the other three are too unwell to go in her place, and after much hesitation, she leaves. The Daleks reveal to themselves that once they've obtained the cure to the radiation sickness, their only use for it is to duplicate it for themselves and leave the four travellers to die. Susan makes her way back to the TARDIS. She obtains the anti-radiation drugs and begins to make her way back out. Having obtained the anti-radiation drugs, Susan comes across a blonde humanoid called Aladon, being one of the Fouls the Daleks previously mentioned. Aladon's appearance contradicts what the Daleks said about both races being mutated, while Aladon in turn is shocked to discover that the Daleks are still alive. Aladon confirms that he was the one who delivered the drugs to them in the first place, giving Susan another batch before stating that the Daleks should not be trusted. The Fouls have come far distances in search of food, with Aladon hoping they can use Susan to broker a treaty between the Fouls and the Daleks in the hope of acquiring some. Susan returns to the three others and administers the radiation drugs, informing them that the Fouls intend to make peace with the Daleks in exchange for food. The Daleks, overhearing, feign agreement of making peace in order to secretly plot against the Fouls to exterminate them. The Fouls are invited to collect food from the Daleks, with the intention being to lure them into a trap, though the Fouls are tricked into believing it's genuine when the Daleks are able to convince Susan to write a letter to the Fouls as she had previously agreed with Aladon. The four travellers decide to stage an argument in their cell, which leads to Susan destroying the camera the Daleks are monitoring them with, and thus they are able to talk freely. They decide to set a plan into motion to cut off a Dalek's power supply. To block the Daleks' vision, Barbara creates mud with the dirt on Susan's shoes, mixed with water that the Daleks provided them with beforehand. A Dalek arrives with food for the travellers. The four of them jam the door, forcing the Dalek to enter their cell, where they overpower it and remove the creature from inside. They wrap the creature inside the cloak Aladon had given to Susan and discard it. As Ian climbs into the Dalek casing, the four exit the cell. Ian figures out how to control the Dalek casing, not needing assistance in pushing him. When a Dalek approaches and asks Ian what he is doing, he tries to convince the Dalek that he is transporting the prisoners for additional questioning. The ruse is broken, however, when the Dalek inquires further, with it soon alerting the others. Susan stages a commotion to get the Dalek to lock them in the lift shaft. The Doctor locks the door to prevent the other Daleks from following them before they all try to get Ian out of the Dalek casing. Being unable to, Ian convinces them to leave in the lift before the Daleks are able to burn through the door and pursue them. The Daleks enter the room and open fire on the Dalek casing, only to find that Ian has managed to get out just in the nick of time and has used the lift to escape. The four notice the Fowls arrive at the Dalek city, but are unable to convince them that it's a trap, with the Fowls being unable to hear them. The Doctor argues that they should leave and not get involved with the Fowls' business, but Barbara protests that they should help because the Fowls gave them the anti-radiation drugs. Ian decides to stay back and warn the Fowls of the trap, while the other three leave the city. The Fowl Elder pleads with the Daleks for a more long-term truce, being unaware that him and the others are being surrounded. Ian, seeing this from afar, informs them that it's a trap. While the Elder is exterminated by the Daleks, many of the Fowls are able to escape. The Travellers and Fowls regroup at the Fowls' encampment, and the Doctor is caught up to speed on the planet's history from their perspective. The Daleks were once known as Dowls and were also humanoid in appearance, but the Dowls actually did mutate into their now Dalek form. It is revealed that the Fowls have come full circle in terms of mutation, but the Daleks have not. The Fowls have become pacifists due to their violent history as warriors. Ian tries to convince the Fowls that they need to fight the Daleks if they intend to survive, but the Doctor thinks they should leave. The choice is decided for them when it is discovered that the TARDIS fluid link Ian had taken from the Doctor earlier has been confiscated by the Daleks, forcing them to return to the city or be trapped on Skaro forever. The Doctor and Barbara argue with Ian to convince him to get the Fowls to fight the Daleks. Ian angers Aladon by threatening to take the young Fowl Dione to the Daleks in order to trade her for the fluid link. Aladon attacks back in response, causing the Fowls to rile up and be convinced to use violence for good. The Daleks have a negative reaction to the Fowls' anti-radiation drugs, causing some of them to fall ill. Discovering that they had become accustomed to the radiation, the Daleks realise they can kill two birds with one stone by raising the radiation levels, allowing them to thrive while the Fowls would die. Two groups are created, one with Ian and Barbara to infiltrate the rear of the Dalek city via a swamp with radioactive mutants, and another with the Doctor and Susan, who act as a distraction by entering the Dalek city via the front entrance. Elion, a Fowl who is a part of Ian and Barbara's group, goes to the swamp to prepare to fill his water bags, but suddenly, a whirlpool begins to form and Elion screams. It is revealed that Elion has died, but the group do not have time to mourn his death as they must continue their plan. Meanwhile, the Doctor's group has reached the city and are able to block the Dalek surveillance systems, and thus are able to sneak into the Dalek city undetected. The Daleks discover it would take them just over 3 weeks to create a bomb big enough to create the amount of radiation they need to survive. Ian and Barbara's group have found a tunnel leading to the Dalek city. One of the Fowls, Antodus, gets cold feet and tries to get the others to turn back. Before they can decide, however, a rockfall occurs, choosing their decision for them. The Doctor and Susan decide to sabotage one of the Dalek static electricity boxes via the TARDIS key, which can siphon away the box's power. While Susan does this, the Doctor short-circuits another panel, which breaks a bunch of the Daleks' computer systems, though this activity alerts the Daleks to their presence. The Daleks reveal their plan to the Doctor and Susan, having changed their strategy away from another neutronic bomb to fast-track the radiation levels by destroying their own nuclear reactors. Ian, Barbara and the Fowls reach a giant chasm, with each of them having to jump over it one by one. A rope is tied between a rock and Ian, with the last one to jump being Antodus, who slips and falls into the chasm, pulling Ian down with him. Antodus decides to sacrifice himself to save Ian by cutting the rope. The rest of the group carries on, but they run into a dead end with their visibility fading. They ponder whether they should turn back, but as their light disappears, they notice another when they see a hole in a cliff and finally find an entrance into the city. We return to the Doctor and Susan, who are in the Daleks' control room. The Doctor, in an attempt to prevent the Daleks from turning the planet into a radioactive wasteland, promises to build them a TARDIS of their own. The Daleks, however, state that they don't need him and can examine the TARDIS themselves. Aladon and a group of Fouls enter the city in an attempt to rescue the Doctor and Susan, but by pure coincidence run into Ian, Barbara and the remaining Fouls from their group. The two groups combine and agree to attack the city in one big force. They are able to prevent the Daleks from releasing the radiation by destroying their systems, which in turn destroys the Dalek static electricity power source. The Daleks begin to die, but not before feigning mercy from the Doctor, requesting he rebuild their systems to prevent them dying out. The Doctor, however, is unable to do this even if he wanted to. The Fouls are appalled by the deaths, but are thankful that the threat of the Daleks has been diminished. Having recovered the fluid link, everyone returns to the Foul camp. The Fouls want the Doctor to stay and lead their people, but he states his truth is in the stars and cannot stay. The Travellers bid farewell to the Fouls and return to the TARDIS. The TARDIS enters flight, but something is wrong as the console explodes and the four of them all fall to the floor. Being the second ever Doctor Who story, the Daleks was given the production code of the letter B. This story was written by Terry Nation, story edited by David Whitaker, and was split between two directors, with Christopher Barry directing episodes 1, 2, 4 and 5, while Richard Martin directed episodes 3, 6 and 7. The Daleks, like the previous story, was produced by Verity Lambert and contains the same four main cast members. This story introduced the now iconic Doctor Who villain the Daleks, and would start a craze known as Dalek Mania. The 7 episodes were released on the then called BBC TV with the following dates. Episode 1, the 21st of December 1963. Episode 2, the 28th of December 1963. Episode 3, the 4th of January 1964. Episode 4, the 11th of January 1964. Episode 5, the 18th of January 1964. Episode 6, the 25th of January 1964, and Episode 7, the 1st of February 1964. This story is one of the rare ones throughout classic Doctor Who to be released in 7 parts, with this practice only being repeated a handful of times in the 60s and only in one season of the 70s. Episode 1, The Dead Planet, had to be remounted, meaning it had to be refilmed, just like the first episode of An Unearthly Child, though this was for less major reasons, with it not needing anything substantial like a rewrite, but because they had captured studio sounds on the original version. Unlike An Unearthly Child's unaired pilot, the original version of The Dead Planet is not known to exist. What ultimately became the Daleks was commissioned by the end of July 1963, then referred to as Doctor Who and the Mutants, though it also had the titles The Survivors and Beyond the Sun at various points. While being referred to as the Mutants during production, it is now commonly known as the Daleks, as to not confuse it with the 1970s serial also called The Mutant. The 16th of September 1963 saw Terry Nation deliver all 7 scripts for the Daleks, 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Originally planned as Serial 4, the Daleks was moved up to become Serial 2. This replaced the original plan of having Anthony Coburn's second story after An Unearthly Child, titled The Masters of Luxor, as the second story. The Masters of Luxor would temporarily be moved to Serial 5, but was ultimately never produced when another Terry Nation story, The Keys of Marinus, was commissioned, though it would eventually get adapted by Big Finish as an audio story and released in August 2012, featuring the then 2 surviving original cast members, William Russell and Carol Ann Ford. Due to Terry Nation's quick turnaround of the Daleks, he was commissioned for a second serial on the 24th of September 1963 called Doctor Who and the Red Fort, which had a set script delivery date of the 16th of December. Though, just like with the Masters of Luxor, this story would never materialise, with not much work being done on it before Terry Nation was working on the Keys of Marinus. The Red Fort could have very well been dropped due to the success of the Daleks widening up the show's scope to include the quote bug-eyed monsters that Sidney Newman was initially against, with the Keys of Marinus being the first story after the Daleks to feature an alien world and non-human characters. Wednesday the 30th of November 1963 saw the recording of the Dalek voiceover for the first episode they appear in, The Survivors, with Peter Hawkins and David Graham being the ones to voice them. A day later on the 14th, Hartnell, Russell and Hill have their contracts extended to support the final 3 episodes of the Daleks, as well as the 2 episodes of the following serial, The Edge of Destruction, and all 7 of Marco Polo, with Carol Ann Ford accepting the same deal later on the 19th of November. On the 15th of November, The Dead Planet is filmed in Lygrove Studio D, marking Christopher Barry's first directed episode, though as previously stated, this recording would later be regarded as unusable, with its remount taking place on the 6th of December. A trailer for Doctor Who was broadcast on Saturday the 16th of November at 5:40 p.m, though there seems to be no apparent record of this. It was followed up with another on the 22nd of November, being broadcast just before 6 p.m. The 22nd of November is also the date the second episode The Survivors is filmed in Live Grove Studio D, as well as the date of the assassination of US President John F. Kennedy, which would cause Doctor Who's first episode to be rebroadcast a week later. Friday the 29th of November sees the third episode, The Escape, filmed in Lime Grove Studio D, with it being Richard Martin's first directed episode. The 3rd of December sees Verity Lambert get the actors' contracts amended, including having a separate one-week contract put into place for the remounted Dead Planet, and making sure the actors are contracted for the entire agreed run of the show, which by this point is 26 weeks long. Episode 4 of The Daleks, The Ambush, is filmed on the 13th of December, with episode 5 being a week later on the 20th. The 3rd of January 1964 sees the cast return from Christmas break and film the 6th episode, The Ordeal, with the final episode, The Rescue, being filmed a week later on the 10th. By the 10th of January, all 4 cast members have accepted the previously stated contract amendment. The Daleks was later used as the basis for a re-inspired version of the story as part of a colour movie called Doctor Who and the Daleks. Peter Cushing would play the Doctor in this, who would be a human inventor, with Ian, Susan and Barbara all being played by different actors as well. Though in this version, Barbara was the name of a human Doctor's granddaughter, Ian was the boyfriend of Barbara, while Susan was a schoolgirl who essentially became the Doctor's second granddaughter, who helped him invent his TARDIS. Ian was played by Roy Castle, Barbara was played by Jenny Linden, and Susan was played by Roberta Tovey. Unlike the main classic Doctor Who TV show, as the story was produced on Technicolor 35mm film, we are able to have a true cleaned up 4K quality restoration. In 2023, The Daleks was chosen to be the first serial of the black and white 60s era of Doctor Who to undergo an official colorisation by the BBC, aptly called The Daleks in Colour. This aired on BBC 4 on Doctor Who's 60th anniversary, Thursday the 23rd of November, 2023. Due to the Daleks' 7-episode length, it was decided that the story was to be cut down and edited for broadcast, including bringing in original Dalek voice actor David Graham to provide new dialogue alongside modern Doctor Who and Big Finish Dalek voice actor Nicholas Briggs. Other changes include new special effects on the Dalek laser blasts, a new musical score, and a montage of clips from the rest of the First Doctor's era at the conclusion of the story, all being colorised as well, before it ends with a focus on Patrick Troughton, alluding to a possible future colorisation being one of his surviving stories. On the 5th of June 1989, The Daleks was the very first Doctor story to get the home media treatment, being released on VHS for the first time. This VHS was also the first within Doctor Who's original VHS range to not be an omnibus edit that would remove the cliffhangers, intros and credits from all the individual episodes, thus meaning that due to the length of this story at 7 episodes, it had to be released across 2 tapes. On the 30th of January 2006, The Daleks was released on DVD as part of the beginning box set that also included the previous serial An Unearthly Child, the following serial The Edge of Destruction, and a 30-minute cut-down version of the missing serial Marco Polo. The Daleks is the first available classic Doctor Who story to be included on BBC iPlayer's back catalogue, with it potentially acting as the first story of the show to a new generation who discovers classic Doctor Who via this method, due to the previous story An Unearthly Child having rights issues. By the time of the making of this video, no Blu-ray release as part of the collection set of Season 1 has been announced. The colorised version mentioned previously got its own standard Blu-ray release on the 19th of February 2024, which also included the DVD disc of The Daleks from the beginning box set. The Daleks was the first ever Doctor Who story to get a novelisation, being released in 1964 as Doctor Who in an Exciting Adventure with the Daleks. This novelisation was authored by the story editor of the on-screen version, David Whitaker. This novelisation was later retitled to Doctor Who and the Daleks and Doctor Who, The Daleks. The novelisation of The Daleks differs greatly from the TV version, including ignoring the events of An Unearthly Child and telling a different version of how Ian met the Doctor. A major difference is how Ian has never met Barbara beforehand, and how the junkyard setup from An Unearthly Child is replaced with a car crash on Barnes Common. Ian isn't an active teacher, instead trying to get a job as an assistant scientist, while Barbara is Susan's personal tutor. A glass Dalek is depicted in this novelisation, something that wasn't featured or planned for the TV version, but would eventually show up over 2 decades later in Season 22's Revelation of the Daleks. The novelisation also depicts a lot of sequences that would have been unable to be created for TV at the time, including a more grand Dalek city and a more uniform, taller and impressively built FOWS. As with An Unearthly Child, the Daleks' 2-inch quad video master tapes do not exist due to being repurposed for newer shows. Thankfully, however, 16mm telerecordings also exist for all 7 episodes, allowing us to still watch the story today. However, some people may notice that episodes 5 and 7 of the Daleks look noticeably worse compared to the other episodes. This is because during the first 2 seasons of the show, the BBC made suppressed field recordings of the episodes that would be sent overseas. These suppressed field recordings would only be half the resolution of the episodes at 188 lines compared to 377 that was used up until the Patrick Troughton story, Enemy of the World, in season 5, when the show was upgraded to 576 lines. While a process was made to retroactively replace these suppressed field recordings with stored field recordings that retain the original resolution, a handful of episodes, including 5 and 7 from the Daleks, only exist on suppressed field. Though a stored field negative of episode 5 does exist, it is damaged. In 2021, the picture negative for episode 7 of the Daleks was found at the BFI. Beforehand, only the sound negative for episode 7 was known to exist, due to the BFI incorrectly logging the picture negative as a duplicate sound negative. While this would help with improvements of picture quality for future restorations, there still seems to be no known stored field copy to exist for episode 7. This is likely due to the original tape having been damaged or wiped by 1967, with the latter option being a bizarre occurrence when apparently they had not wiped any of the master tapes before upgrading their back catalogue of 16mm suppressed field copies to 16mm stored field copies. The Daleks is noted as being the next story that would have been junked had the junkins not been stopped. For various reasons, a handful of 60s Doctor Who episodes were created on 35mm film. This includes episode 4 of the Daleks, The Ambush, though unfortunately there is no known surviving copy of this original master. The reason it was created on this format is either due to episode 1's remount taking up resources, or because it required specific effects that weren't possible via the standard 2-inch quad video master tapes. This serial is a good overall introduction to the Daleks, though it is a tad bit on the long side with 7 episodes, with it having elements that could be cut out to form a tighter story, though I do like the overall story quite a bit despite this. It's interesting how episode 1, The Dead Planet, basically deals with the fallout of the previous serial, An Unearthly Child, an example of how Doctor Who started out having more connections between each of its serials. The downside of this, however, means that a lot of the context that The Dead Planet builds off of is absent if someone was to start classic Doctor Who on streaming services like BBC iPlayer due to the current rights issues with the story, though thankfully, unlike later stories, An Unearthly Child is still available to watch via other methods and isn't missing. I particularly like the sequence in episode 3 where the 4 travellers team up to plan their escape, with all of them getting input into the plan they act out. An unusual part of this story is when Ian describes the Daleks as inhuman, and the FOWS don't seem to react to this. Considering they're FOWS and not human, I'd assume they'd have questioned what he meant by this. It is interesting how we get a contrast between the Daleks and the FOWS, with the Daleks coming off as manipulative beings that will pretend to act in the interest of the others, but actually use the information to plot against them, while the first thing we see the FOWS do is offer the TARDIS travellers aid by medicating them against the radiation poisoning, even if the 4 don't initially catch on to this. Susan gets a bit more to do in this story than she did in the previous, with her being able to successfully obtain the medicine from the TARDIS and return it back to the others. The Doctor's knowledge is on full display in this story, when we get to see him not only deduce what happened to Skaro, but also put his knowledge to good use when fighting back against the Daleks. Ian, once again, seems to be taking up the mantle of setting plans into action and being the one to stay back and help the FOWS when they are lured into a trap. Barbara gets a bit more to do in this story compared to An Unearthly Child, where she helps with the plan to escape, and she takes some initiative by being the one who decides to make mud to block the Daleks' vision. However, she still has moments of being the damsel in distress role, like when Ian has to help her over the lake, though there is also a positive use of this character trait in that she develops brief feelings for one of the FOWS, Gantius, and even almost doesn't want to leave Skaro. While this relationship ultimately doesn't have nearly as much time to develop as the relationship that Ian and Barbara have throughout the 2 seasons of the show they are in, it is still a better arc for her to have compared to the 3 prehistoric episodes of An Unearthly Child, where she just kept falling over and getting upset and frightened. Barbara is an example, in my opinion, of an aspect of classic Doctor Who that has a mix of both progressive moments within the show's early days, as well as has moments that show it is a product of its time. The Daleks in this story were said to originally be called Dals, and the explanation being that they mutated due to the Neutronic War is a piece of information that will get altered come Season 12's Genesis of the Daleks. By no means is this the first or last change or quote-unquote retcon to the lore in Doctor Who. The quote-unquote retcons in Doctor Who are a lot less talked about than those from a Star Wars franchise, where it seems like every single discrepancy between stories is scrutinised, when I feel like the story being enjoyable should take priority. Another thing I could relate this to Star Wars on is how the Fowls remind me of the George Lucas version of the Mandalorians from the Clone Wars, both adopting a pacifist creed due to the history of violence they both had in the past, though their stories both play out very differently. I feel like the story could be rewritten to shorten it a bit, like say have Susan take the box of anti-radiation drugs with her instead of put them in the TARDIS, but then they don't discover what they are until the four are imprisoned, with the Daleks having some reason not to check her for them, or maybe have it where the Daleks do take them and the four have to fight them to get the drugs before they die. In terms of how this would lead to the Daleks figuring out they survive on the radiation, it could have been that the Fowls put 8 dials of radiation inside instead of them giving a separate box to Susan, as in the original. In this version, we cut to the Fowls earlier and see at least one of them decide to follow the four travellers and discover the Dalek city that way, thus condensing it so that Susan doesn't have to go back and forth. Though this would come at the cost of reducing Susan's role in the story, which would be a shame considering how little she gets to show some proper characterisation over the course of her time in the show. And they would have to write in some other way of the four escaping the cell, due to Susan not having the coat that Aladon gave her, though she could still have had mud on her shoes from the first episode when they initially explored the petrified jungle. The four would also have to figure out who the Fowls are when they see them enter the city and get lured into the trap. Maybe they could overhear the Daleks talking about detecting Fowls on the city's perimeter and deduce it's them that way. The Daleks could discover from the anti-radiation box alone that the Fowls survived, and the story had the Fowls all travel to the Dalek city out of the same curiosity that the Doctor had, with this leading them into the Dalek trap. I think they also could have cut scenes out of the journey to get to the rear of the Dalek city, as featured in the latter half of the story, with them maybe combining the sequences of Radiation Lake and the giant chasm into a single hazard, as well as cut out the time skip where they settle for the night. Elion, instead of being killed by the whirlpool in the lake, could have died due to the rockfall caused by Antodus' hesitation. Antodus sacrificing himself could have then also have the added effect of him feeling guilty for getting Elion killed. I think with these reductions, the story would flow a bit better and perhaps be able to work as a 5-parter. I feel like we don't necessarily need the radiation lake sequence, as we have already established by this point that the planet had radiation issues, with the threat of the Daleks turning the planet even more into a wasteland, being enough to keep the threat levels high. I can't help but love how flimsy the Daleks seem in classic Who compared to how they've been portrayed since 2005, with the methods used to defeat them being ones that would mostly seem impossible with how they're now depicted. Though we do get to the odd occasion of them being defeated like they were in Classic Who, as seen with how they're beaten in Series 4's Journey's End in 2008. I will note, however, that I don't blame the story itself for being 7 parts, as it was clearly a product of its time where TV pacing was much slower, and thus had to have extra sequences that might not have been necessary for the story overall to fill out the 7 episodes it was given, not to mention how this story was a replacement for another story that was also meant to be a similar length. I now have an active channel membership available. This will grant you exclusive perks like emojis in the comments, usernames listed in my outros, and updates to what's coming next posted exclusively for members in the community tab. But the best feature is you get 5 days early access to new videos, and you will be supporting me at the same time. To find out more, you can click the join button on my channel page. Thank you to anyone who considers becoming a channel member. Thank you for watching. Please see the video description below for interesting links, sources and credits. And if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and comment. Until the next time, goodbye.